Günümüzdeki Hristiyanlık Pavlus'un icadı mı acaba?
Another question that the Muslims commonly ask, great one. Did Paul invent Christianity? And you can see the implication, the accusation behind the question that here's Jesus, and then there's a time gap, and then Paul comes along and invents the modern Christian religion. There's a time gap between the person Christians claim founded their religion, Jesus, and the person who really did. And that gap is, well, all kinds of corruption could have been introduced. Interesting. The gap is the problem. Well, I think we need to turn that idea of the gap right round and ask that very question back to our Muslim friends and say, well, hang on a moment. If having a gap between your core beliefs and your founder shows that what you believe is false, what do we do with Islam? Because Muhammad dies in 632 AD, and then there's a time gap. 50, 100, 150 years, and really it's then that all the core doctrines of modern Islam really begin coming together. They come together in the 8th and 9th centuries. To give you just one very simple example, the so-called 5 pillars of Islam, those practices that every Muslim who wishes to be an Orthodox Muslim has to carry out. The Shahada, the creed that a Muslim pronounces to become a Muslim. The 5 daily prayers, fasting during Ramadan, pilgrimage, going on Hajj to Mecca. All of those pillars of Islam are not to be found in the Quran. They are hinted at, but they are not fleshed out for a century or two in early Islam. You cannot get 5 daily prayers, for example, out of the Quran. However hard you try, that idea is not there. It arrives later. So if having a gap between what you practice and you believe and your founder is a reason for doubt, then Muslims have a huge problem. Because modern Islam is built on the Hadith, it is not built on the Quran. So what about Christianity? Well, here's the interesting thing. 100, 150, 200 years between Muhammad and the core doctrines of Islam. How long between Jesus and Paul? Well, 10, maybe 15 years. So firstly, much shorter gap. But what about the accusation itself? Did Paul invent modern Christianity in the same way that the Hadith really produced modern Islam? Well, the simple answer is no. All of the core doctrines and core beliefs and core practices of Christianity can be found there in the teachings of Jesus. Let's take just one example. At the heart of Christianity stands the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ upon the cross on Good Friday and his resurrection from the dead on Easter Sunday morning. That core belief that Jesus died for our sins that defines Christianity over and against every other world religion. Was that from Paul or was that from Jesus? Well, Paul talks about it in several places. Paul sets out the kind of idea of the Lord's Supper that Christians celebrate in churches on Sundays around the world, symbolising Jesus' death by eating bread and drinking wine. Paul sets that out. But where does Paul get that from? Well, Paul gets that from Jesus. In all of the Gospels, we read that the last thing that Jesus did, almost the last thing he did with his disciples before he went to the cross and his execution, the last thing he did with his disciples was to celebrate the Jewish meal of Passover. But Jesus reinterprets that meal and puts his death at the heart of it. This is my body broken for you, says Jesus as he shares the bread with his disciples. This is my blood poured out for you, Jesus says to his disciples as he shares the wine with them. That central act of atonement, of Jesus giving his life so that our sins might be forgiven, comes right from the teaching of Jesus himself and is then taken up by Paul. So we don't have a disparity between Jesus and Paul. It's not there, and the gap is not there in the same way as it is with Islam. So the idea of there being a gap between the founder and the modern religion, that is a problem for Islam in a way that it isn't for Christianity. So if you're asked that question by a Muslim friend, gently turn it round and push it back at them and say that is a problem for you as a Muslim. It is not a problem that is there for us as Christians.